So hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for what anchor institutions need to know about affordable housing. This is our second session. I'm Tony Sorrentino. I'm your facilitator on behalf of Campus Compact. Today, we are focusing on affordable housing, past and present. We have the privilege of having Professor Lance Freeman with us today. When I sent out the meeting information for today, Lance's biography and his cited works, articles, books were all in there. I hope you have had a chance to scan that a little bit. I'll keep the minimum introduction just to say that Lance is one of the nation's prominent scholars in actually two fields, city planning and sociology. His real expertise and where I really enjoy talking with him is the dynamics of neighborhood change, why they change, how they change, and the impacts of that on the people who live there. And Lance has taught courses on affordable housing. He's worked in the New York City housing department. He's been a scholar. He's also been a researcher in Washington, D.C. So he touches all of those bases of practice and scholarship and think tanks. So we're going to share our screen with Lance. Lance, we're going to ask you to take it from here. Lance is going to walk us through his presentation for about 20 minutes. Then we'll break in randomly to some groups. We have 25 folks right now. Caitlin, I don't know, 4 groups of 6, whatever works. We'll do that for a couple of minutes. I've asked everyone to contemplate a question as we get deeper into this course. What would prevent or enable an anchor institution from being a developer of affordable housing in their community? That's really where we're going I think as a sector. And then we'll come out and we'll just discuss what we discussed. So with that, Lance, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Really happy to be here. Having an opportunity to talk about affordable housing, which, as Tony mentioned, is something I did briefly professionally. I worked in the New York City Housing Authority. At that time, we were still building or attempting to build public housing, and some of my experiences there actually led me to go back to school. So we could take that for what it's worth. And so what I hope to do today is just sort of give you a brief overview of affordable housing policy in the United States, how it arose, where it's at today, what are some of the main major approaches to affordable housing, and then perhaps be able to connect it to the work you all might do as parts of anchor institutions. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, put in slideshow. Okay, all right, so affordable housing, concern about a lack of adequate housing really dates back to the Progressive era. This is the period of time when United States and other industrial countries were rapidly urbanizing. People were moving to the cities by the millions. And with that, there were a number of problems that were arising. Most obvious, perhaps, were the so-called slums. These were housing conditions that were oftentimes overcrowded, lacked running water, lacked adequate sanitation. And so people were concerned, not only out of the goodness of their heart, but also concerned about the rise of communicable diseases, for example. In many cities, life expectancies actually declined in the first part of the 19th century as people urbanized. And of course, middle class and more affluent households were not immune to communicable diseases. So there was some self-interest in terms of thinking about how do we address the rise of slums. And there was a lot of social dislocations also associated with that. So that really gives rise to the Progressive era and thinking about the housing problem in our cities. Some of the solutions that they thought about were things like building codes. So the first building codes came about at this time, requiring a certain amount of light, for example, requiring the use of certain types of materials to prevent fires. Progressives also put forth the idea of model tenements. This would be decent housing that was built by philanthropists that would be affordable to people with low incomes. So typically, the developers in these cases would earn a profit, but it would be limited, perhaps to say 5% or so. Other reforms came about at this time, the public health movement, social work, uh, regulations like zoning, they all date back to this era when reformers started to grapple with the challenges posed by rapid urbanization, the rise of slums, overcrowding, the spread of communicable diseases, and the like. If we move forward to the Great Depression, there's another substantial change. In particular, many people are out of work. Right? So you have two major problems confronting reformers, both the slums, which were slowly being eradicated, but then now we also have the problem of mass unemployment in many cities. And so, a number of efforts started during this time under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, including most significantly for our purposes, the programs of slum clearance and public housing. So slum clearance was a program whereby the state used its powers of eminent domain to condemn slum buildings, right? So at this time, a lot of the older housing stock, the substandard housing stock where poor people lived, was not up to modern standards. So the solution was to demolish that housing and replace it with decent, affordable housing. So the first permanent public housing was built during the Great Depression. There was a number of cities that participated in the program. And in many cities, particularly those that had industrialized in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you still have public housing that was built in the 1930s, still with us to this day. So you could think of public housing as perhaps the first major federal affordable housing policy or program, and that started during the Great Depression. It was targeted to what we would probably consider the working class, not the poorest of the poor, but the working class. The conditions compared to what else was available were quite good, you could say. And that persisted probably for the next 15 or 20 years, or 30 years even. Public housing was the premier affordable housing program run by the federal government. For a number of reasons, and I'll just briefly touch on a couple. One, public housing was not politically popular. This is the time of the Cold War. So there's a sort of ideological suspicion of large government programs. And so public housing was not always adequately funded. At the same time that the government was building public housing, it was also subsidizing suburbanization, right? It was also making it easier for middle class and working class households, particularly white households. This applies less to families of color. Those households were able to purchase homes in the suburbs. And so what that did is it deprived public housing of its working class and middle class constituency, leaving behind only the most desperate households in many circumstances. And so as a result of that, you had high-rise public housing. This is an image of the Pruitt-Igoe public housing development in St. Louis that were housing the most desperate households in buildings that were not well maintained and that were underfunded. This led to public housing developing a negative reputation as federally or government managed slums. And this is a reputation that still to this day casts a shadow over many affordable housing initiatives. As a result of the failure of, or the perceived failure of public housing, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. It's certainly the case that some public housing was successful, but the failures of many public housing developments led to a shift away from the public housing program. So I'll talk over the next few minutes about some of the more modern approaches to affordable housing that are still in effect to today. Okay. So if we want to define affordable housing, we can define it as housing that's rented or sold at below market prices, or that can only be occupied by households below a defined income threshold. Okay. First, I'll talk about what's known as the supply side. This is affordable housing that's actually built with the intention of being affordable to households. And that would specifically, for example, include public housing. Right? This is housing that's being supplied, right? Affordable housing that's being supplied. So who produces affordable housing in the United States? This chart illustrates 4 sources. The first would just be private, unsubsidized housing that exists on the housing market. The second is housing that's subsidized by HUD. The third by the low-income housing tax credit, and the fourth by state and local government subsidies. So what is important to take away from this chart, or among the more important things, is that the single largest source of affordable housing arises from privately built and owned housing that just happens to be affordable, right? This is just housing that people can afford without having, middle-class incomes, right? That's the single largest source of affordable housing in the United States. As the chart makes clear, the federal government is the single biggest source of subsidies. It dwarfs the amount of subsidies provided by state and local governments. The HUD subsidized category would include things like public housing, housing vouchers, which I'll talk about in a moment, and other programs as well. And the low-income housing tax credit, that now is the single largest subsidy of affordable housing in the United States. The way the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, operates, the IRS distributes tax credits to states, and typically a state's housing finance agency or other similar body distributes the tax credits to developers who, in return for promising to develop affordable housing, receive these tax credits that they can either use to offset their own tax liabilities, or they can sell the tax credits to some other entity that might have a need to reduce their taxes. And so that's the single largest source of funds for affordable housing in the United States today. Just to give you a sense of what the numbers might look like in a particular city, this chart shows subsidized housing in Philadelphia, where Tony and I work, and it gives a breakdown of the different housing programs in the city of Philadelphia. So LIHTC has about 14,000 units, and then there are these other federal programs that also subsidize affordable housing. Section 236, below market interest rate, for example, housing choice vouchers, which I'll say more about in a few minutes, moderate rehab, and the like. So as a result of the perceived failure of public housing in the middle of the 20th century, we've moved away from the federal government directly financing the construction of the affordable housing program, of affordable housing, whether it's public housing or some of the other HUD assisted programs, such as those I have listed on the left side of the chart, the federal government is not providing much in the way of direct subsidies to build new affordable housing. Public housing was seen as a failure. The perception was that the federal government and corresponding local housing authorities could not successfully manage affordable housing, and so they've kind of tended to shy away from that. The low-income housing tax credit, which is a type of federal subsidy, but it's indirect, right? The federal government is not involved in developing or managing these developments. They simply are dispersing tax credits. So from the federal level, we're only indirectly subsidizing the construction of new affordable housing, primarily through the low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC. Okay. Another tool, aside from direct and indirect subsidies, is inclusionary zoning that has arisen, right? And that typically arises in two different approaches. So almost all cities, Houston being perhaps the most notable exception, have some type of land use zoning that regulates what can be built and where, and the density, the building envelope, the uses, and the like. Typically, inclusionary zoning applies to residential zones, whereby if a developer is building a new housing development, some of the housing units are set aside to be affordable, right? And it can either be mandatory inclusionary zoning, meaning all developments that meet certain criteria have to provide some affordable housing, or more commonly, an incentive base. And that typically works where the developer, in exchange for being allowed to build at a higher density and thus earn more profits, they agree to provide some affordable units. What's attractive about inclusionary zoning is, one, it creates mixed income housing, right? So you have both low income, moderate income, middle income houses all living within the same development. So that has some appeal. And second, depending on how the program is calibrated, if the density bonuses, for example, are valuable enough, the additional profits earned by the developer by being allowed to build at a higher density can oftentimes be enough to offset the cost of the affordable housing, right? So it's a way of financing affordable housing without direct subsidies from the government. And so that has some appeal to it, in addition to the fact that it helps create mixed income community. So let me talk about the demand side. So far I've been talking about building affordable housing, whether it's the public housing program, which built new housing, some of the other HUD programs like Section 236 that also financed the development of affordable housing, or the low-income housing tax credit, which also indirectly subsidizes the construction of affordable housing by providing subsidies. On the demand side, we have, instead of building housing, the idea is to provide the household itself with the resources to secure their own housing. And this really arose in the 1960s and 1970s, when the problem of slum housing, that is substandard housing, say without adequate light, without adequate, without indoor plumbing, that became increasingly rare in most American cities. And so the thinking was, we don't really need to build more affordable housing. What we need to do is help households be able to afford the housing that exists. And so under that with that understanding and in that context, housing vouchers were introduced in the early 1970s as a way to help households afford housing without actually explicitly building affordable housing for them, right? And so that represents a major shift in the US housing policy away from building affordable housing, which was primarily driven by a desire to eradicate the slums and replace it with decent housing, towards helping households afford decent housing on their own. Okay. So providing vouchers has several advantages, right? It's cheaper, right, to give a household a voucher that they can then use to rent an apartment, as opposed to paying a developer to build affordable housing and maintain it. So it's a lot cheaper. It also provides tenants more choice, right? The tenant can choose to look for housing wherever they can find it. Whereas if the government builds affordable housing, the tenant is kind of limited to whatever choices the government made in terms of where they're siting the affordable housing. Finally, vouchers tend to lead to less poverty concentration, less racial and ethnic segregation as well. If you think about something like public housing that is means tested, meaning it's limited to only very low income households, by definition, that development will have a high concentration of poverty because everyone living in the development will be poor. That's the way the program is designed. Whereas with a voucher, the voucher holder can seek and obtain housing anywhere where there are apartments or units to rent, as long as the voucher is sufficient to make up the difference between their income and what the rent is charging. So generally speaking, for these reasons, it's cheaper, provides the tenant with more choice, leads to less poverty concentration. Vouchers are seen as having several advantages over project-based or supply-side affordable housing. Okay. As the chart and I should say something about this chart, as this chart shows, not all of the vouchers that are issued are utilized. So probably something about close to a third are not utilized. And so what that means is we have resources that could go to subsidize people's housing, but people are not able to find a unit. So sometimes landlords will discriminate against vouchers. They might associate Section 8 with certain undesirable traits, for example. There are property standards that landlords have to meet to participate in the program. The tenant might not be familiar with different places where they could use the voucher. This image I have on the right just shows it's quite often to see, depending on where the apartment is, landlords refusing to rent to people who have vouchers. And there's no federal law against discriminating against vouchers. Some states and some cities do have such laws, but there's no federal law, and the majority of states and cities do not have a law that makes it illegal to discriminate based on having a voucher. Typically, these laws are called source of income discrimination is legal in many parts of the country. So some of the things that housing professionals have, or affordable housing activists have argued for to combat that would be source of income discrimination laws, mobility counseling for tenants, that is making tenants aware of places that do accept vouchers, recruiting landlords into the program, addressing any concerns they might have, and something called small area fair market rents. So what this does is that the vouchers, instead of being set metropolitan wide, right? So typically the vouchers are set at the 40th percentile for all rents in a housing market. And so if you think about, let's say, Philadelphia, the Philadelphia metropolitan area, that would be based on rents for the city of Philadelphia, where rents tend to be fairly low, and the surrounding suburbs where the rents are higher. And so someone with a voucher in the city of Philadelphia might not be able to afford most of the apartments renting in the suburbs because the housing is more expensive there. With the small area fair market rents, the voucher would be based on the rents set at the zip code level most typically. So even an affluent zip code in suburban Philadelphia, a tenant with a voucher might be able to find units in some place like that. Okay. So how do we think about increasing housing affordability? You know, there is the idea of obviously building affordable housing. There's also the idea of providing a subsidy to the household through a voucher. But increasingly, we're recognizing other approaches that are necessary, allowing for housing to be built that is more affordable, for example. So some cities are experimenting with allowing housing units that are smaller than what the building codes might allow. And so ironically, building codes which arose in the late 19th and early 20th century to address the housing problems of that time, the lack of decent housing, have to some extent become obstacles to providing affordable housing. So, requiring a certain amount of space, forbidding accessory dwelling units, those things make it more difficult to build housing that is affordable to low-income households, right? So these are some of the experiments that cities and states are experimenting with to try to make it easier to build housing that is affordable to low and moderate income households. Okay, and some of the things you might think about is, in addition to the question Tony posed about developing affordable housing, but how does your institution's actions impact I'll use the term naturally occurring affordable housing, because remember, in most places, the majority of affordable housing or housing that's affordable is not subsidized. It's just housing that exists on the market. So is your institution either expanding or engaging in redevelopment that's affecting that stock of housing that is affordable, right? Also think about the role your institution might play in terms of obstacles to affordable housing, whether that's zoning or other regulations that make it difficult to develop affordable housing. And so I think those are some questions to think about, in addition to thinking about, how your institution could be a developer of affordable housing. That's important, but also think about, are there ways that your institution is acting as an impediment in some way to affordable housing? So just to conclude, when thinking about affordable housing, there's both the idea that we need to increase the amount of subsidies, either building more affordable housing, helping households afford housing that already exists, or addressing housing affordability, right? Making housing that exists or allowing for the development of housing that's relatively cheaper. And so I think with that sort of two-pronged approach, that makes it easier to address the challenges posed by affordable housing.
Amazing. Lance, that was a great presentation with a lot of amazing information in there. I can't believe you got all that in 20 minutes. That was
I think
that
it was
was
more like
awesome.
25, but
Yeah, it
okay.
was like a master class for the way that got laid out. Um, I'm sure the group's going to want to ask some questions on the back end. So if you wouldn't mind hanging out with us for a little bit until 3 o'clock, that would be great.
Yeah, sure.
I believe Caitlin is still with us and is able to sort us into some. She gets to be like the Harry Potter sorting hat, and I want to be in Slytherin. She's gonna move us around into different groups. And I loved Lance's questions. I like them more than mine. Which is, I love this idea. We may be impediments we don't even want to be, and yet we are. And that is the kind of two sides of the coin of being an anchor institution. So very interesting. So, Caitlin, if you can, just sort us. And we'll come back at about, what is it, 2:34? I don't know. What do you think? 2:45, we'll say 10 minutes, 11 minutes? You could set a timer probably, Caitlin. Let's say no later than 2:45, because we want everyone to introduce themselves and network just a bit. And then from 2:45 to the end, maybe people can report out from their groups like on some of these questions that Lance put out there. This is a great opportunity just to reflect on our institutions and our relationship to whether we're increasing or limiting housing. So we'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. This is, oh my gosh, it's great to see all the faces. Hopefully you had a good opportunity. Before we go any further, can we do like a physical, virtual kind of round of applause for Lance Freeman? Who's cooler than Lance? That was fantastic. That was I don't know how he did that in 20 minutes, but I feel like I learned everything from like FDR up to modern day. Hopefully you had a chance to kind of get into some of those breakout rooms and think through how an anchor institution, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, is contributing to some of the challenges. We could look for volunteers. You guys were all in different groups. Caitlin was like 1 through 4 or 5. I didn't suggest anyone like volunteer to be your scribe or your readout or spokesperson. And this is really informal, but if there's anybody who represents their group that'd like to chime in, as you do that, I'll look around. If not, I have a question for Lance that might get some things going, which is, Lance, where we are in West Philadelphia, 80% of the housing stock is multifamily apartments and 20% is single family homes. We've made essentially a rental market in West Philly. And I think college towns and college neighborhoods are kind of like that. In your experience, is there any way to kind of keep a neighborhood feeling integrated and diverse and socially, economically, in all of those ways, when you have 10,000 college kids running around and you've got landlords who make a living renting to those college kids who may not be that interested in naturally occurring affordable housing? Is this something you've ever bumped into in your career or studies?
Yeah, I mean, scale is a big part of it, right? And so if you can avoid, say, overly concentrating the students just in one pocket, for example, it's hard to counter that if 95% of the residents are just there for a year or two, they're just coming in and going out. Some type of balance, I think, would be most successful. The town I live in that right now in New Jersey actually has a college, and I was on the town's planning board, and we sometimes had to grapple with grumbling about students and frat parties, et cetera, et cetera. I think we managed it pretty well. The idea is not to discourage students or make students feel unwelcome, but kind of including them in the community. And so including the community is not just students who, come for 4 years or if they're graduate students or what have you, but, they're a part of the community. So I think some care has to be taken to try to, spread the students, around so you don't have like a student ghetto concentrated just in one area. I think that can make it really challenging if that arises.
Thanks for that. I'll turn it over to you all. If you have questions, we've got Lance with us now. I mean, Lance is a Penn now, but he's taught for Columbia many years. Like I said, you probably have an opportunity to ask him questions about the field in general. But was there any conversation that happened in any of the groups that anyone would like to report out on? Any insights or lessons learned or really difficult issues to grapple with? Any volunteers? Okay. Marquette in the house.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rana Altenberg from Marquette University in Milwaukee, and thanks, Lance. I agree with Tony. Your presentation was excellent. I'm just curious in your research, have you identified any communities where there is a really good balance that you just suggested of like affordable housing, student housing, public house? Like, is there a example that exists around the country where that integration of all those different kind of demographics works well? We're trying to create that in Milwaukee in our neighborhood. And I don't know if we're going to make it, but that's our goal.
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to think of some of these things happening and sometimes being a victim of their own success. But, I'll say when I was in graduate school in Chapel Hill, this was a couple of decades ago. I hate to date myself, but at that time, I lived in an apartment that I was able to afford as a graduate student. I was married at the time. A lot of the other households in the community were they were not students, so there was a mix. So to me, it seemed like what made that happen at that time is that housing market had not yet become prohibitively expensive for just regular folks who maybe didn't have professional jobs at the university. So you did have a nice mix of graduate students, some undergrads, not too many, but graduate students, people working, some seniors, right? So I think the places where that's probably most likely to occur would be in cities. You said you're in Milwaukee. I'm not that intimately familiar with the housing market there, but I don't think it's gotten to be a really high cost market yet. So I think there's an opportunity to create that ideal there, where you have students who bring a certain, something to the community. Although their incomes are not that high, you might that population might also be attractive to other types of families, attractive to different types of stores or amenities. And so I think if you can act before the market becomes, heats up and becomes very expensive, I think that can occur. And I think where we are in Philadelphia, in Penn, there's an opportunity to do that to some extent as well, because the housing market hasn't kind of went bonkers yet. I think the challenge we have in Philadelphia is we have a fairly high poverty rate. And so even with housing that is not that expensive compared to some of the cities nearby, there's still an affordability problem.
It's true. Actually, for those of you that don't know, of the top 10 largest cities in the US, Philly is the most impoverished at 34%. You can believe that. Half of them are children, kind of living in backbreaking, abject poverty. It's tragic. And Philly is kind of an interesting city that way. Michelle had her hand up.
Oh, I was just going to say, so Milwaukee has an opportunity to to try to prevent what happens in most of our cities, right? Which maybe 20, 30 years ago, they were affordable and now they're no longer affordable. And thinking about, land trust or somehow, putting the land into community ownership so that it doesn't, so taking it out of the market so that it doesn't face that pressure.
Yeah.
Would feel really.
This is a good idea. Later in these sessions, I think maybe it's 4 or 5, we have a real estate developer coming in who's going to talk about different ways, and land trust is on his agenda. So we can talk a little bit, which is a fascinating kind of topic. Lance, and this may be relevant for others on the call, what do you think about universities and workforce housing? So, what somebody, what you talked about living in Chapel Hill, and maybe some of your neighbors you were a grad student, but maybe some of your neighbors were employees. One of the things that makes us anchor institutions is the wide job ladder that exists at our institutions. Lots of different incomes. It's also great to be able to walk to work or bike to work or take public transit to work. It keeps your costs down. It's better for the environment. I wonder if anybody on this call, or Lance, if you have any thoughts about whether or not an anchor institution should develop its housing for its workforce. Is that income correlated? Does anyone do that? Does anyone know if a university or a hospital or an anchor does that?
I used to live in workforce housing. It may not be what you quite have in mind, but
Okay.
when I was at Columbia University,
Okay.
the university had faculty housing.
Yeah.
And so they did that because to be competitive, given the housing prices in New York City, they probably found it cheaper to buy and manage real estate and lease it to some of their faculty, as opposed to trying to pay competitive salaries that they would need to get people to be able to afford to live in New York City. So I think that could definitely be a successful strategy. Probably in most places where the housing market is not as extreme as it is in New York City, it's probably easier to help subsidize the development of housing or help the employees find their own housing. Giving them some type of subsidy or loan assistance if they want to buy a home or something like that. But I think, New York City's housing market, not only was expensive, quite often it's fairly tight. So there just wasn't a whole lot of housing available.
Right.
So, that's something that the university could do.
That's a good example.
And, to some extent, these are institutions of higher education. Many, it's not workforce housing, but dorms, right? I mean, that can be an important consideration when you're thinking about the impact that the institution has on the surrounding community. If most of the students are moving off campus, that's going to directly affect the local housing market. They're going to be competing with other residents. So that's another way that the institutions can sort of balance their impact.
Think about kind of campus planning and neighborhood planning at the same scale. Jessica, I saw you unmuted yourself.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to echo Chad's comments in the chat, +1 for that. But I also wanted to share that from a regulatory perspective, Stanford was recently, we actually have what's called the Stanford Community Plan. It's actually a guiding document, policy document that's driven by the County of Santa Clara, which is our regulatory agency. And they have now required Stanford to provide a certain amount of housing based on the amount of academic square footage. There's a metric, but we have to provide 100% of the housing. We have to build it. And we're required to build 75% of it on our campus and 25% in the adjacent town that's contiguous with our lands. And it's not that we're afraid of doing that. We're happy to build the housing. But now the new mix is the workforce housing, and it's not considered staff or not considered faculty. It's considered other workers, which are contract workers and not necessarily Stanford affiliates. But employees that are coming on our campus and serving other vendors that have contracts with the university. So if anybody has any examples of how they've accomplished that successfully, we're looking forward to approaching that topic, and hopefully we'll have some success in doing that as well. But we're quite far out in really understanding what that means and how to allow all those various affordability levels to get developed on our lands. So just wanted to share that.
Great examples. I see Sophie's got her hand up.
I was wondering to that point of workforce housing about, mentioned a number of universities, institutions will, subsidize a loan, for example. You can have a $15,000 forgivable down payment assistance. Do we know of any instances where universities extended that to neighbors? Or that sort of support to, community members that could go towards stabilizing communities that they're in as well, or kind of having that anti-displacement work that could counter some of the displacing effects of subsidizing their own employees?
I don't know if anyone else does. I just started a project here in West Philly where there's a nonprofit called Rebuilding Together Philadelphia. It's actually a national group, and we are making grants to sponsor blocks off campus. These are senior citizen homeowners who are starting to grapple with whether or not they have to sell their house or because they can't afford the repairs. So we're coming in to help subsidize the repairs so they can age in place. But I don't know of the loans like you talk about. I see we have a hand up. Is it Shatara Murphy?
Hi, it's Shatara from Pitt.
Shatara.
Sorry, I'm still in my vehicle, so I apologize for my camera being off. So we don't necessarily issue loans at the university, but we are an investor in our community land trust. And so when people in the community are looking for some affordable housing options and they just happen to find their way to the university, we do refer them to the community land trust, who will help them, with subsidizing the purchase of the home. And so, it's a shared equity model. We talked a little bit about this in our breakout room, but the community land trust, they still own land. But then the nonprofit also helps the individual become an owner of the home. And then eventually, through some work, they can become, the owner of the land and the home. But that's who we refer people to when they're looking to university for resources and they're not staff or faculty.
Amazing. Well, we are at time. Just when things are heating up and getting interesting. This is great. Thank you so much for your participation today. Lance, thank you again. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Really,
It's great talking to everyone.
And there's also a lot of great engagement going on in the chat, which is super fun and usually a pretty good indicator that people are into this. And let's keep the conversation going. You'll get notes from me between now and the next session. And there'll be a video copy of this, a recording for you if you want to have it on file to go back and refer to Lance's slides or any of the conversation that went on here. So thank you all very much. Caitlin, anything I forgot to mention before we sign off?
No, I think we're good.
Great. Well, it's great to see all of you. Thank you for your continued interest in this. We have, what do we have? 4 more? 3 more to go? 4 more. Yeah, 4 more. We're going to get into demography. We're going to get into financing. We're going to have an architect talk about how we build these homes with dignity and how site planning can work. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how we prepare our own case study as if we were pitching our anchor president on why they ought to invest in affordable housing. So that's what this is all leading up to. Should be fun. All right, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
You guys.